This video is part 2 of the coil vessel with template. So in part 1, you did see how to make your template, and my template, or templates, if you were able to make 2, you have them close by. And you have fresh wedge clay. Got 2 fresh wedge clay balls near me. I've got a rolling pin, and I'm just going to start making the base. And the base is just the bottom of your coiled vessel. And again, I'm just going to take a ball of my fresh wedge clay, and similar to when you were making your slabs for your cube, you're just going to go back and forth like you saw before to stretch the clay to get started. My base, keep in mind, was only 4 inches wide, right? Show you again the image that I'm trying to recreate. So here to here is 4 inches. And what I found is a lid container, just a plastic lid to a container. And I measured it and it was 4 inches. So I do this all the time when I start a coiled vessel form. Just to, you could, if you prefer to use the manila folder template or a cardboard template, you could certainly trace this, but this works just fine. So you can see I have my circle of clay getting started, and then I'm going to use my rolling pin and you've got your metal rib that comes in your toolkit to also compress the clay, meaning that you go back and forth to just compress those clay particles and to take out the canvas surface. Because I'm working on canvas, you might be working on a textured, even a slightly textured surface, and it might be imprinting in the clay. So I'm wiping that away as well. But most importantly, I'm getting all the particles aligned and everything. I'm smoothing it off so that it really helps to potentially avoid getting any cracks down the road. And this is the trickiest part of this, is you want to have an even bottom base as possible. And you want to keep in mind the most important thing is to not let it get too thin. For a base of a vessel, I always suggest getting it no thicker than 1/2 inch, but certainly no thinner than 1/4 inch. And I suggest doing a little bit thicker than 1/4 inch, because if you don't, as you work and move the clay, it can get thinner and thinner, and that can be problematic just to the structure. I mean, you want, even in coiling anything, you want the heaviest, the thickest coils at the base, so that where it has enough support. Think of it as like it's a support system, right? If it was really baby thin, the coils at the bottom, it might not be able to hold the weight. Especially a lot of people coil really large, life size or 30 feet tall. Coiling is great because there's no limits of how small or large you can construct things with clay with the coiling technique. So I'm just going to cut off the sides and the tops just so I can come closer and show you the thickness and the evenness that I'm trying to achieve. Again, when I do cut the clay, I'm going to just pack it and wrap it in my plastic that's nearby because I don't want to have it dry out. Keep it nice and fresh and workable for as long as possible. So I'm closer. It's almost like I'm making another square for a cube, but I'm not. But you can see it's pretty thick. A little thinner on this side here and thicker as you go along. That's okay for now. I'm just kind of checking in, because keep in mind, this is the size I need. I already have plenty of space to trace out that circular template. So now I'm just going to be really careful, really mindful of the uneven, right? I'm just going nice and gently with my rolling pin, flipping one side, turning it, flipping it again, using my rib too and my spray bottle to lightly spritz, just a light spritz on top of there. You can press and make it as smooth as possible. And I'm going to cut another side with my needle tool or fettling knife. And closer again, because you can see just with a couple turns, it is a very soft clay now, right? I'm not trying to achieve leather hard. You can see it's very wobbly and soft. So you can see the thickness is getting more even. If anything, it is a little thinner on this side. So I'm paying attention to that. Never hurts too if you have your ruler nearby to measure the thickness. That way you can really get precise to make sure that it's even completely on all sides. And I'm working on the canvas table now, but I'm going to put my rolling pin down and bring the piece of sheetrock that you have. And this you'll want to construct on the piece of sheetrock. But keep in mind, this is a very important stage before you lay down your clay. To begin, you do want newspaper. So have some newspaper handy so that you can always have the base, the bottom of your vessel on top of newspaper. And the reason behind that is because, as previously mentioned, your sheetrock is made out of gypsum. It's plaster, and there's only a very thin layer of paper on top of that. So if you were to build, these do take quite a bit of time and weeks to build. And over time, it could just get too saturated with water. The thin coat of paper may want to lift and peel off. And that would be problematic because what's underneath the piece of paper is the plaster. And again, we can't stress that enough, but we do not want plaster and clay to mix. It's not a happy thing. So before I lay my newspaper down, I'm going to cut the Tracy template. And it's also a smooth side, so I can just finish making one side nice and smooth. Flipping it onto a smooth piece of sheetrock, doing the same to this side. I'm content with the thickness now of this piece. It's right around 1/2 inch, which I find works best, and you'll see why as I proceed. Then I'm going to take my template, place that in the center there, take my needle tool and just trace around, and I will come closer. I know you can't see the best here, but you can get an idea. And I need to pick it up just to show you. So that's what that looks like. And then whether you take your paring knife, your fettling knife, your needle tool that came with your toolkit, you can just cut out that circle. And you certainly don't need a template. You could certainly just roll out a square like I did and eyeball it, or have a ruler. If you have a ruler nearby, you could say, okay, my base, you measured it right, it's 4 inches, it's 6 inches, it's 8 inches, could be even less than 4 inches. But that's just how you get to know like the base of the bottom of what the shape is. And you doesn't have to be exact either, but for this purposes, your template is a uniform piece. And the one requirement, of course, is it has to be taller than it is wide. So most of your bases should be fairly narrow, not too wide. So you can see that's what that looks like. Again, it's pretty wet, it's nice and smooth, compressed, no lines of potential cracks starting to happen already, nothing like that. So then here is where you want to clean off the sheetrock, never with a lot of water, just a slightly damp sponge. Grab your newspaper, and it's just one piece of newspaper, large and folded in 4. and then just making one square out of it and placing it down in your sheetrock. And this can be really great because then you can take your bottom, your base, and I'll come closer so as you build up, right, this awesome vessel is going to be built. You'll also have some space where you'll be able to put your tools here, to carry it, to transport it to the campus. Just keep in mind if the sheetrock, you can find another way or another surface to roll your coils out, another table, and then just, you know, have this handy to from here on out. So the coil vessels project is completed, you could potentially just carry it around on your sheetrock. You don't have to, but as you know, you'll see as you build these, especially if your piece is a wider piece, you want to handle it in its entirety as little as possible. So again, that's why the newspaper comes in handy, so that it's not drying too fast in the base. A lot of this project, as you saw in previous projects with working in clay in general, is the timing of clay is crucial. So with that said, I'm going to sit this aside for now, and I'm hoping that's what you can do, is just sit it aside, get your clay. Now you can roll some coils. You've seen the coiling video on how to coil, so I'm just going to proceed with that pretty quickly and not explain. But I will talk about what coils you're going to want size-wise for your vessel. The thickness is pretty much like your base. You do not need to have a coil thicker than 1/2 of an inch, and they might be a little bit smaller too. Keep in mind, because this is the base, like I mentioned previously, the base is going to have, it has to hold all the weight for the 10-inch tall vessel. So that's where you're going to want the coils at this stage to be thicker than the rest, right? As we progress and move up, we can make the coils thinner, so it's lighter. And it also, you don't want to do it in reverse either. I see students sometimes make really small coils to start, but then as they get taller and taller, they're not thinking structurally about it, and their coils will get larger. And then if they don't time it right, or if there's just not enough clay to structurally keep it sound and support it, their vessels collapse. So keep that in mind. Pay really good attention to what you're doing at all times as far as how much weight your vessel can potentially withstand. I'm just going to go ahead and make a few coils with my spray bottle, just a light spritz. And when you're coiling, I often tell students to try to avoid adding more than 4 coils at a time. 4 coils, if they're, you know, 1/2 of an inch, you know, and you should get about, it's confusing now, but you don't want to go ahead and try to build this vessel in an hour. It's just not going to work. So that's really what I'm trying to stress, is you have to do this in stages. And being that it's a 10-inch tall vessel, you ideally should be able to add 4 coils in a sitting in a works timing period, and then come back and check on it later, or another day, cover it tightly, of course, and then add another 4, and then another 4. And there is a lot of time for this project, and it is a daunting project because it is a challenging technique to grasp, but once you do, you can it's a sound technique, and you'll be constructing these vessels in no time. So I think you can see a little bit. I've got this coil, and again, keep in mind, like this, I could wrap around and make a really big. Mine is only 4 inches. So I just want to bring this closer. Pretty uniform. It's not perfect, but it's really about the thickness of my thumb. I would say it's a little less than 1/2 of an inch, and that's pretty good. I don't want to go any thinner because, again, structurally, I want it to be able to support and be able to hold the weight that's coming from here on out. So I'm going to just sit that aside. I'm going to roll one more, and that should be good for this video's purposes, just a slight splits. Hitting all keys of the piano, as I mentioned in the coiling technique video. Uniform as possible is key. And got that. Another thing I want to point out now too is, say you only have an hour to work and you don't have the time to roll your coils as well as attach them and form. It's just, you don't have that amount of time. What you can do is you can prep your coils. So you could just, make as another 3, 4, 5 and cover them in really, really well with plastic. And by that, I mean you can just lay these down on a piece of plastic, spray them, and then cover them really well. And then say you have more time the next day, and you can just start constructing from there. So just want to point out, it doesn't all have to be done at one start and finish time. Okay, so I'm going to bring my bottom back and sit this on my board. These 1 foot by 2 foot boards can really be handy, right? Because you see what I'm doing? I'm creating a workstation all on its own. I have my coils on there, I've got my piece on there, they're on front, and I can really just kind of, work nicely. So I've got my piece there, and this is where we want to go back to this slipping and scoring technique. When you coil vessels, you do not need to slip and score anything but the very first coil. You can, but it's really not necessary. As long as you seal the seam, which I will show you in a few minutes, you do not have to do that. You can just slip and score the first one and progress from there. So slipping and scoring in the very first one just means that I'm doing that cross hatching to the base. Bring it closer so you can see. See how I cross-hatched all around? There was no need to do in the center here because there's only going to be a coil right around the edge. And don't forget your slip. I've got my slip right here in this container. And just dip my fingers and scoop it up pretty good all the way around. And again, always nice to have your water container nearby with your sponge so that you can just keep your workstation as clean as possible. I've got a towel near me to just grab and dry my hands off of. So you can see, got the nice slip-on touch applied there. And then I'm going to add a coil. So I just tore that coil because I knew that it would make it all the way around my 4-inch circumference. And closer, I'm going to put these down here for now so that you can see. Just put that coil on top there. There's that little join that just needs reinforced, and that just needs my smoothing out with my hands. My fingers, I'll come back and show you after I do it. So I'm just smoothing that. Away. And here is where you can begin to see the template. So the template here, I have like an edge that's just going to dart in, right? So it's not exactly what I have here. I want to reinforce that to go in. If my vessel were to go more out, because on my form, you see this bottom part, there's a little, like, you could call it a foot, and it goes in and then bulbs out. You may have a form that does not have that and it just bulbs out. This would be fine then, but in my case, I have that foot. So I'm going to take my fingers and just kind of collar it in a little bit so it's more going this way instead of flaring out. And I'll come back and show you what I mean by that. Now that changed direction, and it's just going out. And for timing purposes, to keep these videos somewhat similar in length, I'm going to stop this part 2 video and stay tuned for part 3 to see how to keep adding coils and shaping this vessel further.